Ladies and gentlemen, this is your man JWKGD Guitar, and today, simple tip for all my new beginners, and I will share with you Nirvana Teen Spirit. You only use two string, A string and E strings. Very simple. Any new beginners can practice that and have fun. It's gonna be sound like that. A string, first fret, fourth fret, E string, first fret, fourth E string, fourth fret. Very simple. Very simple. A string, then E string, E E E E A E E E, A string, E E E E E E. Well, simple and easy. Anyone can play that. You only use first fret E strings and first fret E string, first fret A string. Then you use fourth fret E string, fourth fret A strings.